The challenge of the future, whether we like it or not, whether we know it or not, whether it's a policy or not, is making sure that we utilize resources more efficiently. If we don't do that, we hit resource depletion limits.
Priority number one should be to use our waste, because in an ideal society there should be no waste, because waste should be considered as a potential resource.
Today's so-called development model is completely unsustainable. It's unsustainable because it ignores the costs of nature.
Over the last century, we have more or less tenfold increased the extraction of resources.
Today's reality has exposed just how inefficient and dysfunctional the global economy has become. We need to rethink the way we live and act on this planet.
Economic growth is the goal of nearly every government in the world. In its simplest terms, growth means that more money is spent in an economy every year. But there is a problem with this. The reality is that over the past 30 years in the developed world, wages have not grown quickly enough for people to have more money to spend. Because of this, governments have not been able to raise enough taxes to support greater levels of spending. This should have caused the economy to stop growing, but it didn't. Instead, people, companies and governments have kept on spending by borrowing money from all over the world and relying on high-risk investments. As a result, the economy has continued to grow, but it has been based on ever-increasing levels of debt. The most common measure for the wealth and development of a country is gross domestic product, or GDP. GDP is the total value of everything we make and everything we spend. For households, this could be buying a television, a computer, food and clothes. And for companies, this means buying office materials, resources such as steel for production, energy, and services including telephones and deliveries. And for governments, they have to run hospitals and schools, provide security and a clean environment. Their job is to make sure that the basic needs of society are met. In today's world, the higher the GDP, the greater the wealth of the nation.
The way our economies work now is we measure progress in terms of GDP, which really just measures the financial flows in the economy. It doesn't measure all the other important things, like the way we use resources.
Everybody talks about growth, but how can you have continued growth on a finite planet? The way we are going at the moment is to use more and more materials and energy and resources and water and everything else.
The problem with GDP is that it doesn't include the value of important things such as the free services that nature gives us. Clean air and water, pollination of plants and crops, wild animals, or voluntary work, looking after elderly people. Another problem with GDP is that it does not include the costs to society of environmental pollution from the production of chemicals, energy and materials, or the dumping of waste and the overuse of resources.
GDP is short-sighted because it counts the depletion and degradation of our natural wealth as if it were economic gain. But it is not a gain, it's actually a loss. If a country were to cut down all its forests, GDP would grow because GDP only counts the timber value of the forest once they're cut and sold at market. Our standing forests have immense value, protecting wildlife and a rich biodiversity, providing clean water, preserving soils, preventing landslides, minimizing carbon emissions into the atmosphere, and so much more. But because these values to society are invisible within GDP, it's not a surprise that the world has accumulated a massive ecological debt that doesn't appear in any country's national accounts. There are so many examples of this absurdity. The more fossil fuels we burn, the more greenhouse gases we emit. Then the more GDP grows, and therefore, according to conventional economic dogma, the better off we are supposed to be.
Prices are meant to be a good signal for us what to do and what not to do. At present, there is no price on destroying nature. So if someone has a mine and just digging into it and taking out what is there, he does not pay for destruction that he causes.
When it comes to our use of natural resources, it seems that nobody is paying attention. This is a problem because we are using up natural resources faster than they can regenerate themselves. So we are building up an environmental debt. It is now clear just how unsustainable our use of resources has become. And to make matters worse, we continue to increase our resource use as every year the global population increases by about 70 million people. The United Nations has concluded that if current population and consumption trends continue, by the 2030s, we will need the equivalent of 2 planets to support us. There is a place where the economic crisis has not hit as hard as in other parts of the world. Bhutan, a small country of 700,000 people in the Himalayas, has chosen to base its economic development on a new measure of sustainable wealth, known as gross national happiness, what others might call well-being.
We are a small country, and for many years, Bhutan has deliberately tried to stay away from what we consider as an unsustainable development paradigm. We have been pursuing an alternative development path. Gross national happiness is about the pursuit of the collective happiness of the Bhutanese society by focusing on what matters to the individual. And it is essentially based on the premise that human individual needs more than simply material comfort and satisfaction.
Gross national happiness was first developed in direct contrast to gross national product, as a sharp critique of today's growth-based economic system.
We cannot wait. Human society and the world can no longer wait. We are destroying the world. And the world is sick. World is dying. We can no longer afford the kind of crises, the financial crises that we have experienced, and the pain that it causes, and the suffering that it brings to our people across the world. We have to change, and that change cannot happen if we stay on the same track.
Today we are facing not one, but 2 global crises. We all know about the financial crisis, But there is another, more insidious one that is linked with our misuse of natural resources. Of all these, oil is what drives the global economy. The world consumes 87 million barrels of oil every single day. The USA alone uses 19 million barrels per day. Simply put, our modern society runs on oil. It's used to make and run our cars, trucks, trains and planes. It drives mineral extraction and food production, all essential to running a modern industrial society. But from now on, there will be less and less oil to support our dependency. The International Energy Agency has estimated that we reached the maximum worldwide oil production in 2006, so-called peak oil. And other estimates say that if significant investments in new production are not made, the world's oil output will start to decline by up to 9% a year. The problem with this is that our societies have become locked into oil as a cheap resource. With an exploding world population and escalating demand, especially from China and India, there is a huge pressure to find cheap energy for countries to keep their economies growing. But we have built our economies on the idea of unlimited cheap oil, and this era is now over.
I think that's an interesting thing.
This one piece will make 52 layers.
Watch on mobile devices or the big screen, all for free. No subscription required.
As resources become scarcer, we will need to be more efficient in how we extract and use them. This is clear when we look at oil. The amount of energy needed to extract oil is starting to make absolutely no sense. Just a few decades ago, it was possible to extract 100 barrels of oil using the energy equivalent of 1. But now, we're seeing with some of the newest oil production methods that you only get 3 barrels in exchange for 1. This is simply unsustainable and doesn't make any economic sense. We're beginning to see similar patterns for a lot of other key resources that are important for our society. So we will need to become much smarter and always look at resources from the perspective of how efficiently we can use, reuse and recycle them.
We have stimulus packages to get us out of the current economic recession, which are focused on expanding consumer capacity to buy more goods. The problem is that these goods are made from materials, metals, fuels, and so on, which are getting more and more expensive over time. So you can put more and more money into getting people to buy the stuff, but it's not actually going to get you out of the recession unless you also invest in making those products in more efficient ways so that you can do more with less. When you can do more with less, you can start bringing down the prices.
Humans are dependent on minerals and later on metals since almost the onset of humanity. The history of humanity is marked, or there are milestones which have the name of minerals and metals. The Stone Age, 2.5 million years ago, more recently the Copper Age, the Bronze Age, the Iron Age. These were all huge milestones in the history of humanity, and this story is not ended. Our arch-grandparents, say at the beginning of the 20th century, were probably using 5 or 10 minerals and metals. Nowadays we are using almost every element on the Mendeleev table, and this is growing intensity.
Metals are at the core of the global economy. They are vital to our everyday lives. Metals are used in everything that we have come to depend on in our modern society. They are crucial for the smooth running of our technological world. Currently, the world is experiencing a growing demand for metals and minerals. This has resulted in rapidly rising prices, and we now see an enormous pressure on our planet's resources. It is becoming critical for us to maintain access to metals and minerals at a price that we can afford if we are to continue developing our modern society.
I would like you to imagine what could be a day in our life without minerals and metals. We would be out in the dark, no more electricity, no more houses, no more cars. All these require metals. So we would be out in the dark and shivering in the cold if we wouldn't have minerals and metals. So we need them.
Greenland, land of ice. It is the biggest island on the planet, 10 times the size of the United Kingdom. But with a population of only 58,000, it is one of the smallest nations. Greenland is also one of the most mineral-rich regions in the world, and within the last decade, Greenland has become a new mining frontier.
Greenland is currently seeing a greater interest in mineral exploitation and research. At the moment, we have granted around 100 licenses.
The Kvarnefeld Mountains on the southern tip of Greenland are believed to be the world's second largest source of rare earth metals. Rare earth metals are a critical resource for most of the world's new green tech and electronic innovations, and they've become known as the technology metals. They're a small but vital group of metals in products as diverse as electric cars and smartphones, solar panels, and wind turbines. Today, China has a near monopoly on the rare earth metal market, accounting for 97% of global production. And yet, they only export 25%. This has created an unpredictable market, and with increasing global demand, has meant that prices for some of these technology metals, such as those used in magnets and batteries, have massively increased in just 1 year. The rare earth business is booming and is making Greenland even more attractive for mining and exploitation. Several companies are now exploring South Greenland for valuable rare earth metals.
If it takes off, it'll be undoubtedly be the largest rare earth and uranium project on the globe. This is a diamond drill rig, which drills 3-metre drill runs at approximately 50, 60 metres a day. Drills to a depth of 3 metres at a time. Once it's drilled the 3-metre rod, it's pumped up by water. They pull the rod out and they extract the core from it.
Rare metals are intrinsically important to renewable energy technologies. So in our minerals such as steenstrup, where we know we have all 15 rare metals, some of those metals will be used in efficient lights, some of those metals will be used in the magnets that make wind farms and wave power turn motion into electricity, and some of those were used in the electric batteries that store that electricity. So all those 15 metals in the one mineral, in the one project, it's a major contributor to the world technologies, and it's in a fairly stable part of the world which brings attractions for knowing security, not just next year, but 10 years or 20 or 30 years from now.
For the small fishing town of Narsak, with only 1,600 inhabitants, the arrival of such large-scale drilling operations is bound to have a significant impact.
At the moment, we are standing at a pathway. We can either do it the right way or we can do it the wrong way. And obviously, we want to do it the right way, and also looking at the best available legislation in relation to taking care of protecting the environment.
The economy of the future will need to include the idea of the polluter pays principle and environmental charges, coupled with reductions in taxes on labour.
In the past, resource prices have come down and labour costs have gone up. And we've focused taxation on labour in order to reinvest in the skills and capabilities and technologies to improve labour productivity. If we're interested in resource efficiency, we have to think about resources in the same way.
There are 6 billion mobile phones in the world today. That is nearly one phone for every human being. Population growth and economic development, especially in China and India, means that over the next 20 years, there are likely to be 3 billion more middle-class consumers. So the demand for products, such as electronic goods and mobile phones, will rise dramatically. We are also likely to see twice as many cars in the world within 20 years. To produce all these consumer products, we will need more and more minerals, metals, materials, water, and energy. Meaning that demand for metals alone will double by 2030.
When looking at the 40 most important metals, we see that something like 5 or 6 of them have gone through maximum peak behavior. Within the next 10 to 20 years, another 14 will go through peak. These are the underpinning of creation of wealth in our society. So 10 to 15 years after resource maximum, we go through a wealth maximum. After that maximum, there will be less and less value created in the world. And from that on, we need to do as much or more with less money.
One of the problems of today's economy is that nature doesn't have a price. And indeed, poor people don't have a price. There is often the case that we extract things from nature, which leaves it degraded, and somebody has to pay that cost, or we extract things from society, where people give us labor and their health and everything else, and we don't pay for it. These are real issues that are distorting the prices that we charge.
In Selampur, on the outskirts of Delhi, there is a whole suburb living off collecting, dismantling and recycling electronic waste. Annually, India produces about 400,000 tons of electronic waste, and it is expected to grow by 10 to 15% a year. In addition, each year, 50,000 tons of electronic waste is brought into India illegally from developed countries, because the cost of exporting it to India is half of what it would cost to recycle it at home. But in India, any kind of electronic waste product has a value.
ये सैमसंग की है 80 GB सीगेट की है अब जैसे ये वाला CD रोम का और एक हार्ड डिस्क का बोर्ड आता है इससे छोटा होता है रिलायंस वोडाफोन एयरटेल जो वो की है ना उनके सबके ये आईपोर्ट का बोर्ड ये पेंटियम 4 तरफ से पकड़ लो ऐसे हर चीज़ का पेंटियम 3 उसके अंदर ये इसका कार्ड है बोर्ड ठीक है हो गया
ठीक है हो गया
In the informal electronic waste sector, Every single component of an electronic product has a value. Whether it is copper wire, steel casings and motherboards, it gets recycled and sold on. The informal sector works like an independent mini economy.
मेरे को करीब 8-9 साल हो गए लगी, क्योंकि अभी कुछ टाइम तो हुआ इस लाइन को बने हुए। फ्यूचर अच्छा, आज पहले कंप्यूटर था तो कंप्यूटर में से डीवीडी वगैरह, हार्ड डिस्क वगैरह निकलती थी। अब आगे क्या नाम है, इसकी जगह कंप्यूटर की जगह वो आ गए, लैपटॉप आ गए, एलसीडी आ गई हैं, इसकी जगह कोई दूसरी आइटम आ जाएगी। तो ये सारी आइटमें चलती रहेंगी हमारे पास। कोई भी ऐसी आइटम नहीं है जो ये काम तो कभी बंद नहीं हो सकता।
Electronic waste is an important resource because of the concentrations of highly valuable precious metals within it. It makes a lot of sense to recycle it. You reuse resources which are circulating in the economy. And you reduce the amount of energy needed compared to extracting virgin mineral resources.
In the last 5 years, the consumption of electronic waste, which includes mobile phone, television, refrigerator, electronic appliances, have grown manifold in this country. Now people can afford which they couldn't afford 5 years back. Now these electronic wastes have to be collected from each house once they become obsolete. An organized sector, because of the capital-intensive nature, they need it to come to a central place. From there they can pick up. Whereas an unorganized sector, because of its multiple numbers, huge numbers literally, can go to each house, collect it, and then compile it together, and then dismantle it. So economically, an unorganized sector is far more efficient than organized sector in collecting e-waste.
Today, there are a lot of metals in our cities. Extracting them will turn our cities into the urban mines of the future.
Let us look at the metal gold. Historically, it has been dug up from mountains. We've dug it up for 5,000 years. It's the first metal men had. Nowadays, it's gone into scarcity. The price has gone up, and the mountains are more or less empty. If you now stand between the city and the mountain, there are more gold in the city than there is remaining in the mountains. And imagine the following. If you now have a lorry in front of you with the best gold ore left in the mountains, and you have a lorry of mobile phones, which one will you take? Well, I will take the one with the mobile phones. There's 100 times more gold in that lorry than there is in the best ore.
Our cities contain a lot of valuable metals. These can be collected from recycling points in supermarkets and shops. Here, the various kinds of products are separated and sold on to clean tech smelting facilities according to their price. At the smelters, each metal is handled differently depending on how it will be reused. The additional benefits are that clean tech urban mining uses less energy and creates less pollution. And on top of this, the metals will be of a higher quality and of more value than in any mine in nature.
Recycling is clearly the key to more efficient use of resources, but on its own, it's insufficient. We cannot recycle our way into a sustainable society. We need an approach to recycling based on the cradle-to-cradle idea. And what that basically means is we have to design products that can be disassembled and reused.
We can already see eco-products that are designed from the beginning to be taken apart for reuse. A team of university students has developed the Bloom laptop, a computer that is designed to come apart in just minutes without the use of any tools. At the end of its life, each individual piece of the laptop can be easily recycled. In Europe, you find clean tech companies that are already involved in collecting and extracting metals from household and company waste. They recycle precious metals, and they also produce metals-based materials that are important for a lot of industries.
From our point of view, we see recycling as one of the main opportunities to secure long-term secured access to raw materials. On the demand side, it's important how much is needed today and how much is predicted to be needed in the future. Another important fact is how well can it be substituted or not, and finally, how well can it be recycled or not. In Europe, but also the United States, we see today large streams of illegal or at least dubious exports of end-of-life products into the developing world, where they are treated, if at all, under substandard processes, which lead to high losses of valuable metals, but also to disastrous environmental challenges.
In India, 160 kilometers from Delhi, is the city of Moradabad. Many of the inhabitants are specialized in extracting precious metals and minerals from electronic waste. On the rooftops, families are applying heat to segregate metal components from circuit boards. They use gas torches to heat a board just enough to melt the solder, which separates the metal-containing parts from the motherboard. But it is a job that includes dramatic risks to their health. The burning process creates toxic smoke, which is inhaled by the workers, resulting in numerous lethal health implications, including damage to the brain and kidneys, harming the reproductive and immune systems, causing asthmatic bronchitis and a whole range of cancers. Like many other families in Moradabad, Nazim and his family have extracted metals for many years.
देखा आपने इसका जो मेटल है, सिल्वर मेटल निकल गया है. अब इसके बाद में इसको ऐसी प्लास से पकड़ करके हम निकाल देते हैं. इसको भी ऐसे ही ब्लैंक कर देते हैं सेम. ठीक. फिर उसके बाद में इस पार्ट को हमें अलग-अलग करना होता है, जैसे कि आयरन, एल्युमिनियम, कंडेंसर, ट्रांसफार्मर, एसटी, एलएस, ट्रांसफार्मर, एफडी, आईसी. ये चीज़ सब एक जगह करने के बाद में हम लोग इसे मार्केट सेल कर देते हैं. ये 78 पर केजी, ब्रास 350 पर केजी. वो सब जब एक जगह हो जाता है तो इसमें भी तो कॉपर ही आता है ना. ये भी 350 पर केजी. अगर इसका कॉपर निकाल कर बेचते हैं, मार्केट सेल करते हैं, तो 350 पर केजी जाएगा. और अगर फाइनली इसको ऐसे ही बेच देंगे हम, तो ये 78 पर केजी है. अगर हम लोग पास इतना टाइम नहीं होता है कि हम इसको तोड़ें, निकालें, कॉपर अलग बेचें, वो मसाला अलग जाए. वो सिल्वर वाली, हाँ, उसका अलग प्रोसेसर है. इसको थोड़ा सा छानना पड़ता है, चल्ले में निकालना पड़ता है. नहीं, वो सब आ जाता है. ब्रश के थ्रू सब एकजुट हो जाता है. इसके बाद में उठा करके फिर इसको हम छान लेते हैं. इसकी कोई चीज़ नहीं फिकती है. इसकी जो डस्ट होती है ना, वो भी सेल हो जाती है. इसके अंदर कॉपर होता है जी. इसको जलाया जाता है. जलाने के बाद वो यहाँ नहीं होता है, वो आउट एरिया में होता है, सिटी से आउट. इतना इससे प्रदूषण ज़्यादा होता है इन चीज़ों से. वो यहाँ सिटी में नहीं होता। जी हाँ, इसीलिए सिटी से आउट, जैसे विलेज वगैरह होते हैं ना, वहाँ लोग ले जाते हैं खरीद करके अपने यहाँ, इसको जला लेते हैं, इसका कॉपर निकाल लेते हैं, वो सेल कर देते हैं।
The last process in recycling electronic waste happens down by the river. The ashes from the burnt electronics are sieved, and the unwanted materials washed away, leaving the more valuable metals behind. The people washing out the metals are exposed to a lot of toxic and hazardous waste, and it also heavily pollutes the rivers.
इस सर में क्या नाम है, माल निकल रहा है, पीतल निकल रहा है, कॉपर दिल्ली से आता है। जलाने के बाद फिर ढलाई होती है, कचरा कम हो जाएगा, भारी भारी इधर हो जाएगा। पाउडर बन गया, फिर यहाँ था, फिर धुलता है, फिर उसके बाद क्या नाम ढलाई होकर गलाई होती है, इसकी सिल्ली बनती है, फिर ढलाई होती है। ढलाई होकर क्या इसका क्या नाम पुर्जे बनते हैं पीतल के। आठ 800-700 ग्राम माल बैठेगा फिर इसमें। एक बोरी बिक जाती है करीब किलो के हिसाब से बिकती है। कोई माल होता है 200 रुपये किलो का, कोई होता है 300-350 रुपये किलो का।
We now have a new legislation, and the central component of that legislation is extended producer's responsibility, where companies now will have to take back the product that they sell in the market, recycle it, and if they don't recycle it, they have certain financial penalties to pay.
Production processes in the informal economy and in factories and industries around the world are not only causing serious health problems, but also creating widespread environmental pollution. In India, the explosive growth of nearly 20 million people per year, industrialization and rapid urbanization is increasing the pressure on the environment. It is estimated that nearly all of India's rivers are now so polluted that they cannot be used for drinking water. Samples taken from the Ganges River show levels of bacteria 3,000% higher than is considered safe for bathing. The pollution also gets into people's food through the fish and animals and agricultural crops that they eat. %80 of the sewage in India runs straight into the rivers. And with a population of 1.2 billion, the costs of implementing sewage treatment are enormous.
If we don't think sustainably, then we'll face huge costs due to health problems, due to loss of agricultural soils, due to the cost of cleaning up polluted water.
As we grow mindless of what we're doing to nature, either by pollution or by extraction of resources, the costs of what we do keep going up. So at some point, you have to say, look, we've got to design our future in a way that this damage is minimized.
You can see in China, which is a very interesting example because very strong, very solid economic growth over the last years, but you see also the limits to that growth with rapidly developing massive pollution, contamination of water, loss of fertile soils, to the point where China now is looking to buy agricultural soil, ground outside of China, just because it has not enough clean, safe agricultural ground at home.
Pollution is happening all over the world, with millions of tons of heavy metals, solvents, plastics, and toxic sludge being poured into rivers and oceans and pumped into the air. In Europe, the cost of industrial pollution to human health and the environment is more than $200 billion per year. In North America, the USA imports 10% of its oil from the tar sands of Canada. Because the tar sands are so heavy, they cannot be pumped and have to be mined or extracted by melting the oil out of the sand. So to produce 3 barrels of oil from the sand, you need 1 barrel of oil and 15 barrels of water. For the oil production companies, it's profitable to extract the oil if the world oil price is above $60 per barrel. For Canada, there are enormous revenues, but also costs to society for the environmental and health impacts. And for the world, there are additional costs related to climate change. Tar sands oil produces 3 times the greenhouse gas emissions of conventionally produced oil.
It's very important for me to say that the ice cores have shown us, and other geological evidence have shown us, that climate has always been a dynamic thing. Climate change is permanent. The Earth is a dynamic system. So we should not fear climate change as such. What we should fear is the rate of climate change. And that is what we might actually change with the emission of greenhouse gases. Because a lot of people would say, yeah, but it could be that the 20th century warming and what we see now is natural. Yes, it could be. But what if we make the natural climate variation even worse? Then we are getting in a bad situation.
I did not think that I would see changes what I have seen over the last 10 years, for example, mainly in Greenland. If you go along the coast, what we have seen in the 80s are big glaciers flowing into the fjords, ice streams. Now, these glaciers look, you're hit with a big hammer. They are all cracked in small pieces because the ice is moving that faster into the oceans.
I'm in the ice sheet more than 330 a year, nearly each day, sometimes couple, 3 times a day. Each time I come back to the big ice, that for me is the big change of my mind, because tons of water running from the surface down to the bottom. This is very scary for me. It's like to see melting of the heart of the man.
The tiny little extra push can push the system out of balance. And actually, that's one thing that we really do fear, is that with the present release of greenhouse gases, that you actually can risk to push the ball too far. And then you'll trigger a major climatic change over a very short time.
We can predict in 100 years we lose large portions of the coastline. Population is very dense. Most megacities are along the coast, where you have millions and millions of people. This means these people have to migrate, move inland.
If I were a bus driver and I had a bus load full of people and I was going down the road and I knew there was a curve coming, and then somebody, patted me on the shoulder and says, "I think the road is icy." Would I then continue full speed, or would I just apply the brakes to make sure I could make the curve? Probably adjust the brakes. And I think the politicians should do that too. The decision makers, the voters. Apply the brakes to the emissions of greenhouse gases to make sure that we don't all crash in the coming curve.
There is no longer any doubt that we will have to rethink the way we live on our planet. We already keep track of what we spend and buy at home, at work, in factories and in society. But what we don't do is keep track of the planet's resources that are being consumed more quickly than they can be regenerated. Instead, we need to rethink how to reduce, reuse, recycle, and eventually resource our way of living. Then it will be possible for 7 billion people, or even 9, to live on one planet.
Usukulami ngiliqala ngokuthi ngibase umlilo, qede lapho ebese ngiyathosa ngifake isishebo sami, ebese ngilinde noma 30 minutes. Uma ngipheka ubhontshisi wami ngibeke eziko isikhathi esingango 30 minutes ubile, ebese sengufaka ebhodleleni elimhlophe ngifake kuWonderberg. Ngingafanga Wonderberg ngithatha noma 3 hours. Lesikhathi ngifake Wonderberg ngiyakwazi ukuthi ngiyowasha, ngiyakwazi ukuthi ngihambe ngemfuleni ngiyokha amanzi, ngibe ngicleana egcekeni, ngicleana endlini. uWonderberg ungisize ekuthenini bengiminyane isikhathi eside uma kuthiwa ngipheka entuthwini isikhathi eside, kodwa njengamanje angisaminyane ngoba sekukhona uWonderberg. So ungakafiki uWonderberg bengisebenzisa inyandi bingaliqedi isonto. inyanda mengade ngiyotheza bingaqeda isonto kodwa manje iyaqeda isonto mhlambe no-half.
The Wonder Bag is a life-changing product, and the reason is it's because it's simple. The incentive for people to use the Wonder Bag is very simply 3 things. It saves them time, it saves them money, which also means it saves them having to walk and collect firewood, and thirdly, they have smoke-free kitchens.
Polystyrene is a plastic. It's made from crude oil. It goes through a foaming process, and it ends up protecting your television or various white goods as they return from store to your home. Once that happens, it essentially becomes useless, and it ends up like a block like this, which is really of no use, and it's thrown into a landfill. From here, the foam is then chipped into small granules. Those are shredded up into large amounts of polystyrene. Polystyrene is a great insulator, and that's why we chose it for the Wonder Bag. As the project has grown, we've used up all the polystyrene in our province, and more recently, we've now been using up all the material in South Africa. And my role is working with a team of people to research into other materials that can be recycled.
You know, it is amazing that this factory, in the last 3 months, it employed women, 60 of them. And you can imagine from 24 to 85, the difference in those families. And as we know our families, if one person is employed, that person is catering for almost 10 people. To me, the Wonder Bag stands for eradication of poverty. When you look at the bag, you look at just a simple bag. You look at a factory filled with colorful material bags. But these bags have created jobs. We have got factories in Cape Town, and this bag has made it possible that hundreds of jobs have been created. There's a brand new factory in Pretoria which has employed over 300 people, and that is amazing. And by creating those jobs, it's not just job creation. It is about building people's lives. It's about women being able to take care of their children. It's about women regaining their dignity. It's about women being happy at last.
Ultimately, I foresee for this century a tenfold improvement of resource productivity.
We need to decouple the rate of economic growth from the rate of resource use. If the two continue to climb together, we're going to hit natural limits.
Of course, everything has to be based on life cycle analysis, where you compare the advantages or possible disadvantages of recycling versus use of primary resources.
If we're to live more sustainably, we will need to do a lot more than simply use our resources efficiently. It is time for the world to come together to change the way we live on this planet.
We've got to now see how we can get full satisfaction, full human fulfillment by finding new ways to do things that we like and make us better human beings without having to keep raping Mother Earth.